For those joining our community at the Invisible Evidence for the first time, we invite you to subscribe right now. By doing so, you support independent, fact-driven research into public safety tracking and crime prevention that traditional media overlooked. Let us know in the comments section what city or country you are watching from. To our dedicated returning family, your consistent engagement ensures these timelines are never forgotten, and we offer our deepest gratitude for your continued vigilance. Our analysis begins by tracking a rural household dynamic where a breakdown in security protocols and regional medical reporting set a dark historical precedent. Case 1. In the quiet village of Kirby-on-Bain, Lincolnshire, the 16-year marriage of Ethel Major and Arthur Major functioned under a cloud of intense domestic friction. The baseline of the relationship dissolved entirely when Arthur discovered that Ethel had given birth to an illegitimate child prior to their marriage. This revelation triggered a volatile household environment marked by regular hostility and heavy alcohol use. However, the true security vulnerability lay in a detached property belonging to Ethel's father, a regional gamekeeper. He maintained a strictly regulated, locked chest containing strychnine, a highly destructive chemical compound utilized for agricultural vermin control. In May 1934, Ethel accessed her father's keys without authorization, extracting a specific dosage of the restricted compound. She introduced the toxin into a corned beef sandwich wrapped for Arthur's workplace lunch. Within hours of consumption, Arthur experienced severe muscular contractions and neurological spasms. When the local physician arrived, Ethel directed the medical assessment away from suspicion by fabricating a history of sudden seizures. Relying on this false background, the doctor diagnosed an acute epileptic crisis. Arthur succumbed to the internal trauma 48 hours later, and the initial official paperwork cited natural causes. The administrative closure of the case fractured when a brief, anonymous postcard reached local police. Signed simply with the phrase "fair play," the message raised a specific tactical question. Why had wild birds dropped paralyzed in the immediate vicinity of Arthur's discarded workplace lunch? Scotland Yard initiated an immediate inquiry, ordering a full investigation. Home Office analyst Dr. Roche Lynch conducted a clinical evaluation of the tissue, isolating exactly 1.27 grains of strychnine, a clear lethal volume. The definitive breakthrough occurred during a routine interview at the police station. Before the interrogating detective ever disclosed the chemical findings or mentioned toxicology, Ethel made a catastrophic linguistic slip, stating, "I did not know my husband died from strychnine poisoning." The investigator stopped his questioning. The specific substance had never been introduced into the conversation. This absolute contradiction exposed the premeditated timeline. This event exposed a massive systemic failure in early 20th century pharmaceutical tracking and a total lack of communication protocols between rural medical professionals and law enforcement. At trial, the jury deliberated for 63 minutes, returning a guilty verdict. Despite a substantial public petition for mercy based on Arthur's documented volatility, the Home Secretary refused clemency. The sentence was finalized at Hull Prison on December 19, 1934. Case 2. In the late 1990s, the city of Bangalore, India, became the operating ground for a highly calculated pattern of predatory deception. KD Kempanna experienced absolute financial ruin following the collapse of an informal microfinancing scheme known as a chit fund, coupled with a failed housing construction project. Choosing to sever ties with her family entirely, Kempanna pivoted to a lifestyle of illicit asset acquisition. She designed a specialized public persona, deeply pious, soft-spoken, and elegantly dressed, specifically calculated to blend seamlessly into the heavily populated temple complexes of the region. Kempanna systematically monitored these sacred public spaces, observing the crowds to identify specific targets. She sought out women exhibiting clear behavioral indicators of profound personal vulnerability, those dealing with family instability, illness, or acute emotional distress. Approaching targets such as Muniyama and Nagveni, Kempanna presented herself as an elite spiritual advisor capable of performing secret rituals to reverse their fortunes. She specified one strict operational condition. The individuals must wear their most valuable gold jewelry to properly show reverence to the deities during the process. Once she guided the individuals to isolated, remote shrines, Kempanna instructed them to close their eyes in deep prayer. In that moment of absolute vulnerability, she executed a rapid physical intervention, forcing potassium cyanide into their mouths. The industrial chemical induced systemic failure within 5 minutes, allowing Kempanna to liquidate the assets and vanish into the local population. The logistics of the operation relied on an unmonitored supply chain. Investigators later traced the specialized toxic agent back to a local goldsmith's workshop, where Kempanna had previously secured short-term employment as a domestic helper, granting her unverified access to industrial compounds. The breakthrough in the tracking sequence occurred on December 31, 2007. Local law enforcement had initiated a detailed audit of unregistered precious metal liquidations across Bangalore following a surge in unexplained property losses. Detectives intercepted Kempanna at a local transit point as she attempted to offload a massive, undocumented cache of personal gold jewelry that failed to match her financial profile. This series of events exposed a profound structural vulnerability in unmonitored public gathering spaces and highlighted the total absence of real-time regulatory tracking within regional gold markets. It underpins an absolute necessity for strict personal safety boundaries and public education regarding self-styled spiritual practitioners. At trial, the prosecution presented a seamless chain of physical evidence, securing separate convictions in 2010 for the termination of Munyama and again in 2012 for Nagveni. While initial sentencing matching demanded the ultimate penalty, the Karnataka High Court ultimately commuted the judgments to life imprisonment, citing the strict parameters of the nation's rarest of rare legal doctrine. Kempanna remains held within the secure perimeter of the central prison in Bangalore. Case 3. In the town of Bridgewater, Nova Scotia, the domestic environment surrounding 12-year-old Carissa Boudreau fractured under intense psychological pressure. Her mother, Penny Boudreau, was managing a severe behavioral ultimatum issued by her boyfriend, Vernon McCumber. McCumber demanded that Penny choose between maintaining their romantic relationship or retaining custody of her daughter. This logistical and emotional friction within the household rapidly transformed a protective parental dynamic into a calculated tracking of vulnerability. On the snowy evening of Sunday, January 27, 2008, Penny initialized her plan by luring Carissa into her vehicle under the pretense of an intimate parent-child drive to resolve their recent domestic tension. To establish a false timeline for investigators, Penny later claimed that her daughter had vanished from a local Sobeys grocery store parking lot after an argument. In reality, Penny bypassed the commercial center and traveled to an unmonitored, remote wooded road in the nearby community of Hebville. Following a planned verbal escalation outside the vehicle, Penny utilized a length of twine to completely compress the child's airway. To mislead forensic technicians and deliberately obstruct the tracking of physical evidence, Penny altered the state of Carissa's clothing to simulate a false assault scenario before rolling the body down a steep embankment into the freezing waters of the Lahave River. 2 days after the incident, Boudreau attempted to solidify her deception by holding a highly publicized, emotional television press conference, pleading directly to the public for Carissa's safe return. This narrative collapsed when search teams recovered the frozen body from the riverbank on February 9th. Recognizing significant gaps in the available physical trace evidence, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police deployed a highly structured, 4-month undercover sting known as a Mr. Big operation. Specialized undercover operators integrated Boudreau into a fictitious criminal syndicate, paying her cash to count large sums of money to build corporate trust. Once she was fully dependent on the network, agents presented her with fabricated police evidence files, convincing her that an immediate arrest was imminent. The undercover operators offered to utilize their political connections to permanently destroy the documentation, under one condition. Boudreau had to provide a complete, step-by-step recorded confession to their ultimate crime boss to ensure no loose ends remained. This investigation serves as a critical diagnostic case study on identifying behavioral manipulation within isolated family structures and highlights the strategic validity of alternative undercover metrics. Faced with the absolute clarity of her own recorded statements, Boudreau entered a guilty plea to second-degree murder in January 2009. The long-term legal timeline indicates that following extensive institutional behavioral monitoring and a series of successful unescorted passes, the Parole Board of Canada officially granted Boudreau day parole. She remains under strict public monitoring protocols, legally required to report all future personal and romantic interactions with men to federal tracking officers. Case 4. In October 2001, the transportation infrastructure of Fort Worth, Texas, intersected with a severe breakdown in professional and social responsibility. Shantae Jawoan Mallard, a 25-year-old nurse's aide, was operating her vehicle along the South Freeway, also known as Interstate 35W. Mallard was traveling home after the multi-substance consumption of high-proof alcohol, marijuana, and ecstasy, a combination that completely compromised her cognitive faculties and motor control. At approximately 3 a.m. on October 26th, Mallard's vehicle made high-velocity contact with a 37-year-old pedestrian named Gregory Biggs. The momentum of the impact drove Biggs directly through the front windshield, leaving him lodged in the shattered safety glass. Rather than utilizing her cellular device to alert emergency dispatch or pulling over to render immediate assistance, Mallard continued driving. She navigated the vehicle back to her residence, pulled directly into her residential garage, and lowered the door. Biggs remained trapped inside the vehicle infrastructure, fully conscious. Despite her institutional training as a healthcare worker and hearing audible indicators of distress from the garage, Mallard closed the access point and entered her home. Forensic tracking later established that Biggs survived inside that unmonitored garage for 12 to 24 hours before succumbing to a completely compromised medical response window. The logistical concealment of the event accelerated late on October 26th. Mallard's former boyfriend, Cleet Jackson, arrived at the property along with his cousin to dismantle the scene. Together, they removed Biggs from the vehicle framework and transported him to Cobb Park, where public tracking teams discovered him the following morning. The police investigation stalled completely for 4 months due to a total lack of initial vehicle tracking data. The breakthrough occurred during a social gathering when Mallard casually verbalized the details of a vehicular impact to an acquaintance. The individual immediately contacted the Fort Worth Police Department. Execution of a search warrant uncovered a heavily altered vehicle interior, backyard burn remnants matching the car upholstery, and distinct human bloodstain patterns on the concrete garage floor that perfectly matched Biggs' genetic profile. This investigation highlights a catastrophic failure of mandatory reporter ethics and demonstrates the absolute necessity of automated collision detection tracking and instant emergency alerting inside modern vehicle telematics. At trial, the state dismantled the defense of accidental displacement, using forensic evidence to prove that timely intervention would have fully altered the medical outcome. The jury returned a verdict of guilty for murder and tampering with physical evidence. Mallard received a 50-year institutional sentence. She remains held within the state correctional system, with her initial timeline for parole eligibility scheduled to open in 2027. Case 5. In Akron, Ohio, the local community recognized Christy Marks as an established entrepreneur who operated Ponies and Pigtails, a highly successful youth equestrian and instructional franchise. Inside the household infrastructure, however, an entirely different financial calculation was underway. Her adopted daughter, Taylor Marks, managed to gain unauthorized access to Christie's private legal files, specifically discovering a copy of a 2004 will. The document designated Taylor as the sole financial beneficiary of the entire suburban property, capital holdings, and commercial franchise. This asset discovery triggered a deliberate tactical plan. On the evening of October 24, 2009, at approximately 8 p.m., Taylor initiated a phone call to her mother, claiming her vehicle had suffered a sudden mechanical failure and was stranded in a dark commercial parking lot located on Springdale Drive. Christy immediately traveled to the coordinates to render assistance. An associate named Troy Purdy, who had been integrated into the plan under the promise of a $5,000 payout from the future estate liquidation, emerged from an unmonitored area of the lot. Purdy carried out a severe physical intervention, inflicting 13 sharp force wounds. Taylor and her boyfriend, Brian Smith, actively monitored the event from an adjacent vehicle. Once the confrontation ended, they dialed 911, reporting a fraudulent narrative of a random transient assailant. The emergency cover story unraveled rapidly under professional analysis. Within 4 hours of separate law enforcement interrogations, the local timeline completely collapsed. Detectives bypassed the conflicting verbal statements by executing an immediate digital forensic audit of the suspect's mobile devices. Network tracking data and localized tower handshakes conclusively proved that Taylor Marks, Brian Smith, and Troy Purdy were in continuous electronic communication while positioned inside the exact same parking lot for an extended period prior to the emergency call. This case exposed profound structural vulnerabilities regarding the security of family estate documents and highlighted a critical need for advanced behavioral tracking metrics within adolescent social networks. The legal system responded by activating Ohio's statutory Slayer Clause, an architectural legal barrier that completely prevents an individual from acquiring financial or property assets from a targeted estate. Troy Purdy entered a guilty plea to aggravated murder, receiving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. To avoid a scheduled capital trial, Taylor Marks entered a formal guilty plea, resulting in a mandatory life sentence. She remains held within the secure perimeter of an Ohio State Correctional Facility. Case 6. In October 1981, ideological volatility intersected with high-stakes criminal logistics in Rockland County, New York. Kathy Boudin came from a background of significant intellectual and legal status, as the daughter of prominent civil rights attorney Leonard Boudin. However, she had bypassed this conventional infrastructure, spending over a decade living underground as a federal fugitive following a 1970 explosion at a Greenwich Village safe house linked to radical political cells. On October 20, 1981, heavily armed operatives from the Black Liberation Army and the Weather Underground executed a coordinated ambush on a Brinks armored transport vehicle at a shopping center in Nanuet, New York. The tactical assault resulted in an immediate fatal outcome for guard Peter Page and left guard Joe Trambino with severe physical injuries, allowing the group to secure $1.6 million in capital. Boudin assumed a critical role in the escape phase, operating as the primary driver of a large U-Haul vehicle positioned to facilitate the asset transfer. When local law enforcement rapidly established an emergency roadblock, Boudin exited the vehicle cab with her hands raised, explicitly pleading with the intercepting officers to lower their weapons. This calculation of compliance successfully compromised the officers' defensive readiness, providing an immediate opening for 6 heavily armed operatives to emerge from the rear of the truck and launch a surprise offensive. The resulting confrontation led to immediate law enforcement fatalities. Officer Waverly Brown succumbed instantly at the scene, and Sergeant Edward O'Grady passed away from extensive trauma 90 minutes later at a regional medical facility. Boudin abandoned the vehicle and attempted to escape on foot, but an off-duty corrections officer monitored her movement and successfully detained her nearby. Forensic specialists utilized precise ballistic tracking and microscopic vehicle matching to tie the deployment of the weapons directly to the cargo area, establishing a solid legal chain of custody that connected Boudin explicitly to the underlying felony murder charges. This severe breach forced a total reorganization of multi-jurisdictional law enforcement communication networks and introduced rigid new safety protocols for armored vehicle transit operations across the United States. In 1984, Boudin entered a guilty plea to felony murder and robbery, receiving a sentence of 20 years to life. State tracking logs indicate she secured parole release in 2003, with her timeline concluding with her passing in May 2022. In a striking chronological footnote, Armored Guard Joe Trambino, who survived the initial 1981 ambush, ultimately lost his life while performing emergency response duties during the September 11, 2001, attacks on the World Trade Center. Case 7. In the coastal region of the Outer Banks, North Carolina, a severe breakdown in municipal tracking infrastructure set the stage for a catastrophic vehicular collision. Melissa Marvin possessed a documented record of severe driving infractions, including 2 separate legal interventions for operating a vehicle while heavily intoxicated. Yet, a critical vulnerability in how regional jurisdictions logged and communicated repeat offenses allowed her to retain operating privileges without active electronic or legal monitoring. On April 6, 1999, Marvin spent the hours between noon and 2 p.m. consuming high-proof alcohol across 2 local commercial establishments. She then took control of a Mitsubishi Montero, traveling north along U.S. Highway 158 at a velocity of 60 miles per hour. At 2:50 p.m., Marvin completely bypassed a red light sequence at the intersection of Ocean Bay Boulevard. The high-mass vehicle broadside a Chevrolet Cavalier occupied by 5 17-year-old high school students. The force of the high-velocity impact resulted in immediate biological cessation for 3 of the occupants at the scene: Megan Blong, Angela McGrady, and Amanda Geiger. A 4th passenger, Shauna Lawler, survived for a 6-day emergency medical window before internal structural injuries resulted in terminal failure. The 5th occupant survived the collision but sustained permanent, life-altering neurological damage. Forensic specialists conducted blood extractions 4.5 hours after the impact, which returned a blood alcohol concentration of 0.21%. Using mathematical retrograde extrapolation, toxicologists mapped her exact chemical baseline at an astronomical 0.28% at the precise moment of the intersection breach. This landmark case exposed massive systemic gaps in how municipal courts track repeat chemical offenders across regional boundaries. Recognizing the absolute disregard for public welfare, prosecutors bypassed standard involuntary manslaughter charges. Instead, they pursued a sophisticated legal strategy, successfully securing convictions on 4 counts of second-degree murder under the doctrine of depraved indifference to human life. Presiding Judge Jerry Tillett utilized consecutive sentencing mechanics to establish a strict accountability precedent, issuing for back-to-back terms totaling a minimum of 60 years. Marvin remains held within the secure custody of the North Carolina State Prison System. Case 8. In Durham, North Carolina, the interior dynamics of a local residential property became the focus of an intensive forensic review. Crystal Mangum had previously entered the National Media Archive in 2006 due to a high-profile legal dispute involving unverified allegations against university athletes, an event that ultimately resulted in the formal disbarment of a regional district attorney. By early 2011, the public scrutiny had faded, but the underlying behavioral instability within her private sphere remained unaddressed. Mangum was engaged in a highly volatile domestic living arrangement with her partner, 46-year-old commercial painter Reginald Day. On April 3, 2011, the persistent friction within the residence escalated into an extended physical confrontation involving mutual aggression. During the terminal phase of the altercation, Mangum retrieved a standard kitchen knife and delivered a deep, targeted penetration to Day's torso before exiting the apartment, leaving the location unmonitored. Day secured emergency transit to a regional medical facility, where trauma teams initiated immediate surgical interventions. He survived for a 10-day window before experiencing systemic failure directly caused by the internal trauma on April 13th. Durham police investigators mobilized a formal homicide inquiry. During the legal proceedings, Mangum's defense team asserted an absolute self-defense narrative, claiming that Day had physically dragged her by her hair, forcing a defensive reaction. However, state forensic specialists systematically dismantled this framework. A detailed reconstruction of the apartment crime scene, coupled with an analysis of the exact anatomical angle and trajectory of the wound pattern, directly contradicted a defensive positioning, proving instead an active, offensive deployment of the weapon. This investigation exposed critical public policy blind spots regarding recurring domestic volatility interventions and illustrated how high-profile media narratives can frequently distract from active, local safety patterns. Following the presentation of the forensic data, the jury deliberated for 6 hours, returning a guilty verdict for second-degree murder. Presiding Judge Paul Ridgway issued a minimum term of 14 years and 2 months. Mangum remains held within the secure perimeter of the North Carolina correctional system. The compilation of these distinct inquiries reveals a definitive operational truth. Human deception inevitably fractures when confronted with empirical tracking and forensic advancement. The transition from early 20th century administrative oversights to modern digital analytics illustrates a steady closing of institutional loopholes. Whether mapping the environmental degradation parameters of a controlled space, isolating microscopic chemical anomalies, tracing the illicit liquidation of financial assets, or auditing the statistical metadata of healthcare facilities, the progress of investigative methodology continues to systematically dismantle calculated cover stories. Beyond the immediate legal resolutions, these historical events function as structural diagnostic data for societal frameworks. The systemic vulnerabilities exposed across these chapters, ranging from gaps in regional elder protection registries to communication breakdowns between municipal courts, have directly driven the development of modern safety boundaries. By analyzing exactly where these internal and public protocols failed, legislative, medical, and law enforcement infrastructures have successfully updated tracking telematics, established rigid protective precedents, and refined reporting ethics to safeguard vulnerable populations. Ultimate accountability is not merely achieved in the courtroom. It is maintained through the continuous refinement of institutional vigilance and data-driven oversight. Thank you for watching, and yes, stay with us for more.